The sun was setting over the Montana hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. James stood on his front porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching his cattle graze peacefully in the distance. His German shepherd Rex lay beside him, content and calm. This was the life James had dreamed about for years. No stress, no danger, just peace and quiet. 8 years ago, James had bought this 200-acre ranch with his retirement savings. It wasn't fancy, but it was his. The main house was simple but comfortable. He had a large barn for his horses, several storage sheds for equipment, and miles of open land where he could think and breathe. After spending over 2 decades in the military, this place felt like heaven. The small town nearby was called Cedar Valley. It had one main street, a grocery store, a diner, and a hardware shop. The people there were friendly but minded their own business, which suited James just fine. When folks asked what he did before moving here, he just said he was in the Army. That was enough for them. They didn't need to know the details, and he preferred it that way. James was 52 years old now. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face carried lines that told stories he'd never share. He'd spent 23 years in special operations, doing things most people couldn't imagine. He'd been to countries whose names he still couldn't mention. He'd led teams through situations that would have broken ordinary men, but all of that was behind him now. These days his routine was simple and predictable. Wake up at dawn, feed the animals, check the fences, fix whatever needed fixing. He'd learned to rope cattle, mend broken gates, and even deliver a calf when necessary. His hands, once trained to handle weapons and tactical gear, now worked with tools and hay bales. It was honest work, and it made him feel human again. The local folks knew him as quiet but reliable. When old Mrs. Patterson's tractor broke down, James spent an afternoon helping her fix it. When the community center needed repairs after a storm, he was there with his tools. People respected him even though they barely knew him. That was exactly how James wanted it. But lately something had been bothering him. There had been reports on the local news about robberies in the area. Several ranches within 50 miles had been hit over the past 3 months. The pattern was always the same. Criminals would target isolated properties, steal livestock, equipment, and anything valuable they could load into trucks. They'd strike at night and disappear before anyone could respond. The sheriff's department was stretched thin. Cedar Valley only had 3 deputies to cover hundreds of square miles. By the time law enforcement arrived at a crime scene, the thieves were long gone. The local news had started calling them the night crew, and people were getting nervous. Some ranchers had started sleeping with guns beside their beds. James had noticed something else, too. 3 days ago, while checking his southern fence line, he'd found tire tracks in the mud near the tree line. They were fresh, maybe a day old. Someone had driven out there, stopped, and then turned around. It could have been someone who got lost, but James's instincts told him otherwise. Those instincts had kept him alive in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and he'd learned never to ignore them. That evening, as he locked up the barn, Rex started acting strange. The dog's ears went flat and a low growl rumbled in her throat. She was staring toward the southern part of the property, where the fence met the dense cluster of pine trees. "What is it, girl?" James asked, crouching beside her. Rex didn't stop growling. James pulled out his flashlight and scanned the darkness, but he couldn't see anything unusual. Still, the dog's behavior confirmed what he already suspected. Someone had been watching his place. Back in the house, James sat at his kitchen table with a map of his property spread out in front of him. He marked the location where he'd found the tire tracks. Then he pulled out a notebook and started making observations, just like he used to do before missions. Possible entry points, escape routes, blind spots in his security. His mind, which had been in relaxation mode for years, shifted into tactical analysis almost automatically. He had security cameras set up around the property. They weren't the cheap kind you'd buy at a regular store. When James set up his security system, he'd used his military contacts to get equipment that was far more sophisticated than what most civilians had access to. The cameras had night vision, motion detection, and they fed directly to monitors in his bedroom. Most people who saw them thought they were just standard cameras. They had no idea what they were really looking at. James checked the camera footage from the past week. On Tuesday night at around midnight, he spotted something. A dark-colored pickup truck had driven slowly past his property on the main road, then turned onto the dirt path that led to his southern fence. The truck had stopped for about 5 minutes. Someone had gotten out. but the distance was too far to see details. Then they'd driven away, his jaw tightened. This wasn't random. Someone was scouting his property, planning something. Most people in his situation would have called the sheriff right then, but James had spent enough time in the field to know how these things worked. He had no proof of intent to commit a crime. The truck hadn't crossed onto his property. The sheriff would take a report, increase patrols if possible, but realistically, there wasn't much they could do until something actually happened. James made a decision. He wouldn't wait to become a victim, but he also wouldn't go looking for trouble. He'd simply be prepared. That night, he went to his gun safe and pulled out his Glock. It had been a while since he'd carried it, but the weight felt familiar in his hand. He also retrieved his tactical vest from storage, checked his flashlights, and made sure his first aid kit was fully stocked. Before bed, he did something he hadn't done in years. He ran through mental drills, scenarios of what might happen and how he'd respond. Where would attackers most likely enter? What would their objectives be? How many might there be? His training came flooding back like muscle memory. You never really stopped being a soldier. You just learned to hide it better. Rex seemed to sense the change in him. The dog stayed closer than usual, her eyes alert and watchful. As James finally lay down in bed that night, he didn't actually plan to sleep much. He set his phone beside him with the security camera app open. Every hour, he'd check the feeds, scanning for any movement or unusual activity. At 2:15 in the morning, his eyes snapped open. He hadn't been fully asleep, just resting in that half-aware state that special operations soldiers learn to master. Something had triggered his subconscious. He grabbed his phone and checked the cameras. There, on the southern perimeter, the motion sensors had detected something. His screen showed a dark pickup truck with its lights off, rolling slowly along the fence line. As he watched, the truck stopped. 4 figures got out. In the green glow of the night vision cameras, James could see them pulling out bolt cutters. His peaceful retirement was about to be interrupted. James got out of bed, his movements calm and controlled. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his vest, and checked his weapon. Rex was already at the door, waiting. "Looks like we've got visitors, girl," he said quietly. "Time to remind them why you don't pick the wrong house." He moved through his home in complete darkness, not turning on a single light. Every step was deliberate and silent. Outside, the criminals were cutting through his fence, completely unaware that they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They thought they were robbing a lonely old man on an isolated ranch. They had no idea they'd just walked into the home of someone who'd spent 2 decades hunting the world's most dangerous enemies. The cold night air hit James's face as he slipped out the back door of his house. He moved like a shadow, staying low and using the darkness to his advantage. Rex followed close behind, her training from years of living with a military man kicking in automatically. The dog knew to stay quiet. Through his night vision scope, James could see 4 men working on his fence. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces partially covered with bandanas. One of them was cutting through the wire with bolt cutters while the others stood watch. Their body language told James everything he needed to know. These weren't professionals. They were sloppy, overconfident, and making noise. The fence gave way with a metallic snap that echoed across the quiet ranch. The men climbed through, heading straight toward his barn where he kept his horses and expensive equipment. James had 3/4 horses worth about $15,000 each, plus 2 ATVs, welding equipment, and various tools that would fetch good money on the black market, but they weren't going to get any of it. James had already planned his approach. The barn had multiple entry points, but these men were going in through the main door, the obvious choice. That told him they hadn't done much planning. They were counting on speed and the element of surprise. What they didn't know was that James had been awake and watching them since they pulled up. He circled around, using the equipment sheds and hay bales as cover. His movements were fluid and silent, the result of countless hours of training in urban warfare and rural operations. He positioned himself behind a tractor about 30 feet from the barn entrance, giving himself a clear view and multiple escape routes if needed. The 4 men reached the barn door. One of them pulled out a crowbar and started working on the lock. They were talking now, their voices low but audible in the quiet night. "Hurry up, man. We need to be in and out in 15 minutes, one of them said. "Relax, the old man's probably dead asleep. This is going to be easy money," another replied. The lock broke with a crack and the barn door swung open. The men stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. James could hear his horses stirring, disturbed by the intruders. This was the moment. James could have called the sheriff right then and waited for backup. But he knew the response time. By the time deputies arrived, these men would have loaded up his property and disappeared into the night. He'd filed enough police reports in his mind to know how it would go. Maybe they'd get caught eventually, maybe not. But his horses would be traumatized, his equipment gone, and his peace of mind shattered. No, that wasn't going to happen. James stood up and walked toward the barn entrance, his posture relaxed but ready. He left his weapon holstered. He wanted to give these men one chance to make the right choice. "Fellas, I think you're in the wrong place," James said, his voice calm and steady. The 4 men spun around, their flashlights blinding in his direction. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of them, a tall guy who seemed to be the leader, started laughing. "Old man, you need to turn around and walk back to your house. Pretend you didn't see nothing and nobody gets hurt." James didn't move. "I'm giving you one opportunity to leave. Right now. Walk back through that fence and keep driving. I won't call the police and we'll forget this ever happened." Another one of the men pulled out a pistol, pointing it in James's general direction. "You think this is a negotiation? Get lost before things get bad for you." James sighed. He'd tried. Last warning. "Leave now." The leader took a step forward, pulling out his own gun. "Last warning? Man, are you serious right now? There's 4 of us and 1 of you. Do the math, Grandpa." What happened next would later seem impossible to the men trying to explain it to the police. James moved. Years of training compressed into seconds of action. He sidestepped into the shadow of the barn wall, disappearing from their flashlight beams before they could track him. The criminals started shouting, swinging their lights around, trying to find him. James had spent 2 decades learning how to operate in darkness. He knew every inch of his barn, every piece of equipment, every shadow. These men were stumbling around in unfamiliar territory with flashlights that destroyed their night vision. The first guy went down hard. James came up behind him and swept his legs out from under him with a precise kick to the back of the knee. As the man fell, James caught his gun hand, twisted it, and removed the weapon in one smooth motion. The whole thing took about 3 seconds. The man hit the ground with a grunt of pain, his knee screaming. "What the? Where did he go?" one of the others shouted. James was already moving to his next position. He used the sound of their voices and footsteps to track them. They were panicking now, bunched together instead of spreading out. Amateur mistake. The second man was searching behind a stack of hay bales when James struck. A quick strike to the solar plexus knocked the wind out of him, followed by a takedown that left him gasping on the barn floor. James secured his hands with zip ties he'd pulled from his pocket. "Always be prepared, Tommy. Rick, where are you guys?" The leader's voice had lost its confidence. 2 down, 2 to go. But James knew the last 2 would be the most dangerous. Cornered and scared meant unpredictable. He was right. The remaining 2 men started firing blindly into the darkness. Bullets punched through wooden walls and ricocheted off metal equipment. James had already anticipated this and positioned himself behind a solid steel tool cabinet. The horses were in a separate section of the barn protected by thick walls. He'd designed it that way specifically for their safety. "Stop shooting, you idiots," James called out. "You're just wasting bullets and giving me your positions." The shooting stopped. Heavy breathing filled the silence. "Who are you?" The leader called out, his voice shaking now. "I'm the guy who owns this ranch. The guy who wanted to spend his retirement in peace. The guy you should have left alone." James moved again, circling around. He could hear one of them trying to creep toward the door. Not happening. He grabbed a handful of loose screws from a workbench and tossed them across the barn. They clattered against the far wall and both men spun toward the sound, firing again. While they were distracted, James closed the distance. He came up behind the third man and put him in a control hold he'd learned in combatives training. The man struggled for about 5 seconds before James applied pressure to the right nerve cluster. The guy went limp, not unconscious but completely unable to move from the pain. "Drop the gun, now," James said quietly. The weapon clattered to the floor. That left the leader, who was now alone and terrified. James could hear him breathing hard, backing toward the barn door. "You can still walk out of here," James said. "Your friends are going to need medical attention, but they'll survive. You can run or you can join them in custody. Your choice," the leader bolted. He ran for the barn door, tripping over his own feet in his panic. James let him go. He could have stopped him easily, but 3 out of 4 was good enough. The leader would be caught soon enough. Right now, James needed to secure the scene and call the authorities. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911 while keeping watch over his 3 detained intruders. 911. What's your emergency? This is James Wilson at the Cedar Valley Ranch on Route 47. I have 3 attempted burglars detained on my property. 1 fled the scene heading west in a dark pickup truck. I need sheriff's deputies and possibly an ambulance. No one has life-threatening injuries, but they'll need to be checked out. The dispatcher sounded surprised. Sir, are you safe? Are the suspects secured? James looked at the 3 men on his barn floor. 1 was still gasping for air, 1 was holding his injured knee, and 1 was zip-tied and thoroughly defeated. Yes, ma'am. I'm former military. The situation is under control. 20 minutes later, red and blue lights filled his driveway. Sheriff Linda Calhoun stepped out of her vehicle, her hand near her weapon until she assessed the scene. What she found was James sitting calmly on a hay bale, Rex beside him with 3 handcuffed suspects lined up against the barn wall. Mr. Wilson, she said slowly, taking in the scene. Want to tell me what happened here? James stood up and brushed off his jeans. These men cut through my fence and attempted to rob my barn. I detained them and called you. Pretty straightforward. The sheriff looked at the 3 suspects, then back at James. You detained 3 armed men by yourself? Yes, ma'am. She walked over to examine the suspects. 1 had a swollen knee, 1 was still catching his breath, and the 3rd had zip tie marks on his wrists and looked like he'd seen a ghost. Mr. Wilson, I think you and I need to have a longer conversation. Let's start with what exactly your background is. James nodded. He'd known this moment would come eventually. His quiet life was about to get a lot more complicated. Sheriff Linda Calhoun sat across from James at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold between her hands. It was nearly 4 in the morning, and the deputies were still processing the crime scene outside. The 3 suspects were already on their way to the county jail, and an APB had been issued for the 4th man who'd escaped. 23 years, the sheriff said quietly. Looking at the military service record James had reluctantly pulled from his filing cabinet. Delta Force. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and Lord knows where else that's probably still classified. James nodded, staring into his own coffee cup. I came here to leave all that behind, Sheriff. I just wanted peace and quiet. Well, you've got an interesting way of finding it, she said with a slight smile. Those 3 men are singing like birds down at the station. They're terrified of you. One of them asked if you were some kind of ninja. Despite himself, James chuckled. I'm just a retired soldier who knows how to handle himself. The sheriff's expression turned serious. There's something else you need to know. The leader who got away, his name is Vincent Kane. We've been tracking him and his crew for months. They're responsible for at least a dozen robberies across 3 counties. Vincent's got a mean streak, Mr. Wilson. He doesn't take embarrassment well. You think he'll come back? I know he will. Men like that, their ego is everything. You didn't just stop his robbery, you humiliated him in front of his crew. He'll want revenge. James set down his coffee cup. When? Could be days, could be weeks. But he's got connections. He might come back with more men, more weapons. I can station a deputy here, but honestly, we're stretched pretty thin. I've only got 3 deputies covering the whole county. No deputy, James said firmly. I won't put one of your people in danger. Besides, I can handle myself. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. I don't doubt that, Mr. Wilson. But handling 3 unprepared criminals in your barn is different from facing a coordinated attack from angry men with something to prove. After the sheriff left, James stood on his porch watching the sunrise. Rex leaned against his leg, sensing his troubled thoughts. The peaceful retirement he'd built was cracking. He could feel it. Part of him had hoped he'd never have to use his training again, but another part, the part that had kept him alive through countless missions, was already analyzing the situation. Vincent Kane would come back. That was certain, and when he did, he'd bring more firepower and probably more people. James could handle himself, but the thought of turning his ranch into a battlefield didn't sit right. This was his home, his sanctuary. He pulled out his phone and stared at a number he hadn't called in 3 years. The guys from his old unit had scattered across the country after retirement. Some had stayed in touch, others had drifted away. But the bond they'd formed in combat never really disappeared. He wondered if they'd even answer. His thumb hovered over the call button for a full minute before he pressed it. The phone rang 4 times. Then a familiar gravelly voice answered. "This better be important. It's 5 in the morning. Carlos, it's James Wilson." There was a pause, then the voice on the other end changed completely. "Reaper? Is that really you, man? Reaper?" That had been his call sign in Delta Force. He hadn't heard it in years, and hearing it now brought back a flood of memories. "Yeah, it's me. Listen, I've got a situation. I need advice." Over the next 10 minutes, James explained everything. The attempted robbery, the escaped leader, the sheriff's warning. Carlos listened without interrupting, which had always been his way. He was the team's intelligence specialist, the guy who planned operations while everyone else executed them. "You still at that ranch in Montana?" Carlos asked. "Yeah. And you're telling me some punk criminal thinks he's gonna roll up on Reaper's property with his little crew and teach you a lesson? That's about the size of it." Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Brother, you remember Istanbul?" James did. 6 of them against 20 hostile combatants in an urban environment. They'd won. "These aren't trained fighters, Carlos. They're just criminals. Doesn't matter. You taught us something in every operation we ran. You remember what it was?" James closed his eyes. "Never fight fair. Use every advantage. Protect the team, exactly. So here's what you're gonna do. You're gonna call the rest of the guys. Tommy's in Colorado, only 6 hours away. Blake's up in Washington State. Even Mitchell might come out of his hermit cave in Oregon if you asked. We're all bored out of our minds with civilian life anyway. I can't ask you guys to drop everything and come help me with my problem. You're not asking. I'm volunteering. And trust me, the others will too. You saved all our lives at one point or another. You think we're gonna let you face down some wannabe tough guys alone? Call them, tell them Reaper needs the team. We'll be there by tomorrow night." After hanging up with Carlos, James made 3 more calls. The response was the same each time. Tommy said he'd be there by evening. Blake could fly in by tomorrow afternoon. Mitchell, who'd been living off the grid in the Oregon woods, said he'd drive through the night and arrive by morning. James felt something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't excitement exactly, more like purpose. These men had been his brothers. They'd trusted each other with their lives in the worst situations imaginable. If anyone could help him defend his home, it was them. But even as relief washed over him, James knew what this meant. His quiet life was over, at least for now. The man he'd been trying to leave behind was coming back to the surface. He looked at his hands, rough from ranch work, and remembered when they'd held different tools for different purposes. The rest of that day, James prepared. He walked every inch of his property with fresh eyes, not as a rancher but as a special operations soldier planning a defense. He identified choke points, places where attackers would have to funnel through. He noted sightlines, cover positions, and escape routes. His ranch, which he'd built for peace, could also serve as a fortress if needed. He checked his ammunition supplies and equipment. Most of it was still in good condition, stored properly. He had flashbangs he'd legally purchased for predator control, flares, night vision gear, and communication equipment. Nothing illegal, but everything professional. That evening, as darkness fell, a dusty pickup truck pulled into his driveway. Tommy stepped out, a duffel bag over his shoulder and a huge grin on his face. He was stockier than James remembered, with a thick beard and flannel shirt that made him look like a lumberjack. "Reaper," Tommy called out, walking up to the porch. "Man, it's good to see you." They embraced, the kind of hug that only brothers in arms could share. "You didn't have to come all this way," James said. "Are you kidding?" My wife was thrilled. She said I'd been driving her crazy being home all the time, said I needed a mission. Tommy looked around at the ranch. "Nice place. Worth defending." "It is to me." Tommy got serious. "So what's the plan, boss?" James smiled. Even after all these years, Tommy still called him boss. "Same as always. We assess the threat, prepare the battlefield, and make sure the bad guys regret ever hearing my name. Just like old times." "Not quite. We're not trying to eliminate anyone. Just send a very clear message. Understood. No permanent damage, just permanent lessons." They spent the next few hours going over the property. Tommy, who'd been a combat engineer, immediately started suggesting improvements. "We can set up motion sensors here, create a perimeter alarm system there. Nothing that'll hurt anyone, just give us early warning." By midnight, when they finally called it a night, James felt something he hadn't felt since his military days. Confidence, not arrogance. but the solid knowledge that he and his team could handle whatever came their way. As he lay in bed, Rex curled up on the floor beside him. James thought about Vincent Kane. The man was probably out there right now, gathering his people, planning his revenge. He thought he was coming to attack a helpless old man on an isolated ranch. He had no idea what he was actually walking into. Vincent Kane was about to learn a lesson that James had taught to enemies around the world. Some people look easy to beat. Those are usually the most dangerous ones. By Saturday afternoon, all 4 men had arrived at the ranch. James stood in his living room looking at faces he hadn't seen in years. Tommy with his thick beard. Flake, who'd lost some weight but still had that sharp, calculating look in his eyes. Mitchell, who looked like he'd been living in the woods for a decade, which he basically had. And Carlos, who'd driven straight through from Nevada and looked exhausted but alert. They sat around James's kitchen table with coffee and sandwiches, falling into old patterns like no time had passed at all. The jokes came first, the way soldiers always handled tension. "Man, Reaper, you really know how to throw a reunion," Blake said, biting into a sandwich. "Most people just do barbecues. Where's the fun in that?" James replied with a slight smile, but the lightness didn't last long. They had work to do. Carlos spread a hand-drawn map of the property across the table. James had marked all the key points, entry routes, blind spots, and defensive positions. "Okay, let's talk through this," Carlos said, slipping into his old role as the planner. "According to the sheriff, this Vincent guy has connections. He could show up with anywhere from 5 to 10 people. They'll be armed, probably with rifles and handguns. They'll want to hit hard and fast. They'll come at night," Mitchell added. He'd been a sniper, used to thinking about approach routes and timing. "Probably between midnight and 3 in the morning. That's when they think we'll be least prepared." Tommy leaned back in his chair. "The question is, what are our rules of engagement? Back in the day, we had clear orders. What are we working with here?" James had thought about this a lot over the past day. "We're not in a combat zone. These are criminals, not enemy combatants. Our goal is to stop them, scare them enough that they never come back and keep everyone alive, including them." "Non-lethal response only," Blake confirmed. "I can work with that. We've got flashbangs, right?" "Several. Also smoke grenades, tactical lights, and good old-fashioned intimidation." Carlos nodded, making notes. "We turn this place into a nightmare for them. They think they're attacking an old man's ranch. Instead, they walk into a coordinated defensive operation that makes them think they've stumbled onto a military base. Over the next several hours, they transformed the ranch. Motion sensors went up along the fence line, connected to alerts on their phones. They set up overlapping fields of observation, so no one could approach without being seen. They created fallback positions and communication protocols. Mitchell took position in the barn loft with night vision equipment, giving him a bird's-eye view of the entire property. Tommy rigged up several surprise deterrents, non-lethal but effective. Blake and Carlos would patrol the perimeter. James would coordinate everything from the main house. "Just like old times," Tommy said as they finished setting up. "Except nobody's shooting real bullets at us." "Let's keep it that way," James replied. They didn't have to wait long. The sheriff called James's cell phone at 9 that evening. "Mr. Wilson, one of my deputies spotted Vincent Kane in town about an hour ago. He was with at least 6 other men, loading supplies into trucks. It looks like they're preparing for something." "Tonight then," James said. "I can have deputies there in 30 minutes if you want protection." "Negative, Sheriff. We've got this handled, but I'd appreciate it if you could have units on standby about 10 minutes out. We'll call if we need backup." There was a long pause. "Mr. Wilson, what exactly are you planning?" "Just going to have a conversation with some uninvited guests. Nothing illegal, I promise." After hanging up, James gathered the team. "They're coming tonight. Everyone knows their positions?" 4 heads nodded. They'd all checked their equipment 3 times. Everything was ready. "Remember, our objective is to neutralize the threat without causing permanent harm. We want them arrested, not hospitalized. These guys aren't worth throwing away our freedom over." "Understood," they said in unison. As darkness fell, the 5 men took their positions. James sat in his living room with all the lights off, watching multiple screens showing feeds from cameras around the property. Rex lay beside his chair, alert and silent. The dog had been through enough operations with James to know when it was time to be serious. At 11:45, the first motion sensor triggered. James's phone buzzed. A text from Mitchell. 2 vehicles approaching from the south. Lights off. Count 8 individuals. James texted the others. Showtime. Stay sharp. Non-lethal only. He watched the screens as 2 pickup trucks rolled slowly onto his property through the cut fence line. 8 men got out all armed. They moved in a loose formation toward the barn and main house. Vincent Kane was easy to spot. He was the one giving orders, pointing at different buildings. They had no idea they were being watched by 5 of the most highly trained soldiers America had ever produced. The criminals reached the barn first. That's when Tommy triggered the first surprise. Massive floodlights, the kind used on construction sites, suddenly blazed to life, blinding the intruders. They shouted and stumbled, covering their eyes. Before they could recover, Blake triggered the second phase. Speakers James had set up around the property came to life with a deafening alarm sound, disorienting and confusing. The men scattered, trying to find cover. "What the hell is this?" one of them shouted. Vincent Kane was yelling orders, but his men were panicking. This wasn't what they'd expected. Then Mitchell's voice came through a loudspeaker, calm and authoritative. "You are trespassing on private property. You are surrounded. Drop your weapons and lie face down on the ground. This is your only warning." Instead of complying, several of the men started shooting blindly into the darkness. Bullets pinged off metal buildings and thudded into wooden posts. None of them had any idea where to aim. They were shooting at shadows and sounds. James gave the signal. Phase 3. Carlos and Blake, wearing night vision and moving like ghosts, approached from 2 different directions. They each carried non-lethal deterrents. Blake tossed a flashbang grenade that exploded with a massive boom and blinding light. The men who'd been shooting dropped their weapons, clutching their ears. Carlos moved in with a smoke grenade, filling the area with thick, choking smoke. The criminals couldn't see, couldn't hear properly, and were completely disoriented. Tommy emerged from behind the barn, using a high-powered tactical flashlight to further blind anyone who tried to run. One by one, the criminals were herded into a tight group near the barn entrance, exactly where James wanted them. Mitchell kept watch from above, calling out positions. 2 trying to run east. Blake, you've got them. Blake intercepted the runners, appearing out of the smoke like something from their nightmares. He didn't hurt them, just positioned himself in their path and let them run right into his arms. Both men went down in controlled takedowns that left them breathless but uninjured. Within 5 minutes, 7 of the 8 criminals were on the ground, hands behind their heads, completely defeated. Only Vincent Kane was still standing, his gun pointed shakily into the darkness. "Show yourself," Vincent screamed. "Fight me like a man." James stepped out of the shadows, unarmed, his hands visible. Rex walked beside him, a low growl rumbling in her chest. "You wanted to come to my home, Vincent? Here I am." Vincent pointed his gun at James, his hand was shaking. "You think you're tough? You think you can humiliate me? I don't think anything, I know. You came to my property twice now. Twice you've failed. Your crew is finished. Your reputation is destroyed. The only question now is whether you're smart enough to put down that gun and end this peacefully. I'll kill you." "No, you won't. Because you're not a killer, Vincent. You're a bully and a thief who thought you could push around someone you saw as weak, but you chose the wrong target." 4 red laser dots appeared on Vincent's chest. Tommy, Blake, Carlos, and Mitchell had all positioned themselves with tactical lights that looked like weapon sights in the darkness. Vincent looked down at the dots, his face going pale. "Your friends are lying on the ground waiting for the police. You can join them peacefully, or we can make this harder. Your choice. But either way, this ends now." Vincent's gun hand dropped. The fight went out of him all at once. He fell to his knees, defeated. James pulled out his phone and called the sheriff. "Sheriff Calhoun? This is James Wilson. I've got 8 individuals secured on my property. They're ready for pickup. No injuries, no shots fired by us. Situation is completely under control." 20 minutes later, the ranch was flooded with police vehicles. Sheriff Calhoun walked through the scene, looking at the 8 handcuffed suspects, then at James and his 4 friends standing calmly near the house. "Mr. Wilson," she said slowly, "I'm going to need a very detailed report about what happened here tonight." "Of course, Sheriff. We simply defended private property using non-lethal deterrents. Everything we did was legal. Those men fired weapons recklessly. We just made sure nobody got hurt." She looked at the elaborate setup, the equipment, the precision of the operation. Non-lethal deterrents, right. Vincent Kane, sitting in the back of a police car, stared at James through the window. The look on his face said everything. He'd learned a lesson he'd never forget. Some people aren't what they appear to be. The sun rose over the ranch on Sunday morning, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink. James stood on his front porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching his 4 friends load their gear into their vehicles. The past 36 hours felt like something from another lifetime, yet here they were, saying goodbye like it had all been perfectly normal. Tommy was the first to finish packing. He walked up to the porch and extended his hand, but James pulled him into a hug instead. "Thanks for coming, brother," James said. "Anytime. Literally anytime. My wife said I came back looking 10 years younger. Apparently I needed this." Tommy grinned. "Though she also said if I come home with any more crazy stories, she's going to make me start a blog." Blake joined them, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "You know, I forgot how good it feels to work as a team. My security job is boring compared to this." "Boring is good," James replied. "Boring is safe." "Yeah, but boring doesn't give you stories to tell." Blake looked out at the ranch. "You've built something good here, James. Worth protecting." Mitchell came up last, quiet as always. He didn't say much, just nodded at James with that understanding that came from years of shared experiences. Some things didn't need words. Carlos was checking his truck one final time when Sheriff Calhoun's vehicle pulled into the driveway. She got out carrying a folder of paperwork and wearing an expression that was hard to read. "Gentlemen," she said, nodding at each of them, "I've spent the last 12 hours processing reports, interviewing suspects, and reviewing every piece of footage from last night." James felt his stomach tighten slightly. And I've come to the conclusion that what happened here was one of the most professional defensive operations I've ever seen. Everything you did was legal. Non-lethal force, clear warnings given, no excessive actions. Those men fired weapons on your property. You simply neutralized the threat. The tension in James's shoulders eased. "However," the sheriff continued, "I also know that what I saw wasn't just luck or good preparation. That was military precision. Special operations level coordination." She looked at each of them. "You were all Delta Force, weren't you?" The 5 men exchanged glances. Finally, James nodded. "Yes, ma'am, all of us. Different years, but we served together on multiple deployments." Sheriff Calhoun smiled slightly. "I figured. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you. Vincent Kane and his crew have been terrorizing this county for months. We've got them on multiple charges now, thanks to their little visit here. They're looking at serious prison time." "What about the 3 from the first night?" Tommy asked. "Already cooperating with prosecutors. They're giving us information on other crimes, stolen property locations, the whole network. This case is going to clear a lot of unsolved robberies." She turned to James. "Mr. Wilson, you've done this community a real service, even if it wasn't what you intended." After the sheriff left, Carlos pulled James aside. "You going to be okay here? We can stay another day or 2 if you need us." James shook his head. "No, you guys have lives to get back to. Families, jobs. I'll be fine." "You sure? Because we can rotate. Someone can always be here if you need backup." "I appreciate it, Carlos. I really do. But I think the message has been sent. Word's going to spread about what happened here. I doubt anyone will be stupid enough to try this property again." Carlos smiled. "Yeah, I imagine the story's already making the rounds. Don't mess with the old guy on the ranch. He's got friends." He grew serious. "But if you ever need us for anything, you call. We're not just old teammates, James. We're brothers. That doesn't expire." They said their goodbyes one by one, each man promising to stay in touch, to visit, to not let another 3 years pass. As James watched them drive away, Rex sitting beside him, he felt something unexpected. Gratitude, yes, but also a sense of closure he hadn't known he needed. For years, he'd tried to completely separate his military life from his civilian life. He'd packed away that part of himself, thinking it was the only way to find peace. But the past few days had shown him something different. Those experiences, that training, those friendships, they were part of who he was. Not something to hide from, but something to integrate. The next few days were strange. News of the incident spread through Cedar Valley faster than James expected. The local paper ran a front-page story. "Local rancher thwarts armed attack." They didn't mention his military background, respecting his privacy, but people connected the dots anyway. James went into town on Tuesday to get supplies. He expected awkwardness, maybe even fear. Instead, people treated him with a new kind of respect. Old Mrs. Patterson, whose tractor he'd fixed months ago, gave him a pie. The hardware store owner refused to let him pay for a new section of fence. The waitress at the diner brought him extra coffee without asking. "You made us all feel safer," she said simply. "Thank you." That evening, James received an unexpected visitor. A young man in his mid-20s pulled up to the ranch in a dusty sedan. He got out nervously like he wasn't sure he should be there. "Can I help you?" James called from the porch. "Mr. Wilson, my name is David Chen. I'm a veteran, Army infantry. Did 2 tours in Afghanistan." The young man took a breath. "I heard about what happened here, about you and your team. I wanted to meet you if that's okay." James invited him up to the porch. They sat and talked for over an hour. David had been struggling with civilian life, feeling disconnected and purposeless. He'd moved to Montana hoping the change would help, but he still felt lost. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," David admitted. "In the Army, everything made sense. I had a mission, a purpose. Out here, I'm just existing." James understood that feeling better than the young man knew. It takes time. You have to find a new mission, something that matters to you. For me, it's this ranch. Taking care of the land, the animals, building something instead of destroying things. But you didn't stop being a soldier, did you? I mean, you still have those skills. "The skills never go away," James said. "But you learn when to use them and when to put them aside. Most days I'm just a rancher. But when the situation called for it, yeah, I could access that training. The key is balance." David looked thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? Do you ever miss it? The action, the purpose, the brotherhood?" "Every day," James admitted. "But I don't regret leaving. I did my time, served my country, and I'm proud of that. Now I'm serving myself, my peace, my future. That's important too. You don't stop being valuable just because you're not in uniform anymore." They talked until the sun started setting. Before David left, he shook James's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. I think I needed to hear this. Anytime. And David, you're always welcome here. If you need someone to talk to, someone who understands, my door is open." Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The fence was repaired. The security equipment stayed up, but James didn't obsess over it anymore. He fell back into his routine of caring for the ranch, watching sunsets, and enjoying the peace he'd fought so hard to protect. Carlos called every few days just to check in. Tommy sent photos of his kids. Blake shared stories from his security job. Mitchell, true to form, sent short text messages that somehow said everything. "Still alive. Woods are nice. Miss you guys." One evening, about a month after everything happened, James sat on his porch with Rex and thought about how much had changed. He'd come to Montana to escape his past, to leave the soldier behind and become just a simple rancher. But life had taught him something important. You can't divide yourself into pieces, keeping some parts and discarding others. He was James Wilson, retired Delta Force operator and Montana rancher. Both things at once. The soldier's discipline helped him run an efficient ranch. The rancher's patience had taught him a peace he'd never found in military life. They weren't separate identities. They were both him. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it and smiled. It was David. The message was simple. Started volunteering at the Veterans Center. Helping other guys transition. Found my new mission, thanks. James typed back. Proud of you. That's what we do. We take care of our own. As darkness fell over the ranch, James realized something. He'd spent years thinking he needed to leave his military life completely behind, to find peace. But peace wasn't about forgetting who you were. It was about accepting all of yourself and finding balance. The ranch was quiet again. The criminals were in prison. His friends were back to their lives, but closer now than they'd been in years. And James had finally made peace with both sides of himself. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, protecting what mattered, helping when needed, and living the life he'd earned through decades of service. Rex nudged his hand and James scratched behind her ears. What do you think, girl? Think we can keep this peace going? The dog's tail wagged slowly. James took that as a yes. Some men spend their whole lives searching for purpose. James had found his not by running from his past, but by integrating it into his future. He was a warrior who'd learned to farm, a soldier who'd found peace, a leader who'd discovered that sometimes the best way to protect people was simply to live well and be ready when needed. As the stars came out over Montana, James smiled. He was home in every sense of the word, and that was worth everything.